In this lesson, we are going to talk about how to approach shooting indoor group shots. In some ways, this is similar to our previous example, because for a larger group shot, we are going to have 2 or more rows of people that we will be shooting. This means that we will need to have a depth of field large enough to cover them. And because people might be viewing this at closer distances than a typical photo to see individual faces, we might want to increase our depth of field even more to account for this. The big issue is light, or the lack of light. Unless you are composing your group shot near a giant window with an abundance of sunlight, lighting indoors will be a serious limitation. Over the last few months, I've had the opportunity to take several group shots of my kids' wrestling team, some more casual than others. At the start of the tournaments, they would gather for a group shot with the wrestlers and coaches. I shot a few of these with my DSLR. Because of the attention span of young kids, I didn't have a lot of time to mess about with settings. A lot of times what I would do is set my ISO somewhere in the middle, set the shutter speed to 1/200th because they are kids and they don't understand the concept of being still, set my aperture to f2.8, put on a speed light, and pray. The lighting in almost every school gymnasium is terrible. It's very low and terrible color quality. Without a speed light, I would be in the neighborhood of ISO 2000, which is a bit high. And almost all of the light comes from above, which is nice and even, but it doesn't fill in the faces and eyes very well. In a few minutes, I will show you how I did some really nice looking group shots for the team that took a little bit more setup. But first, I wanted to show you how I got there. The main hurdle for a group shot is depth of field, and especially with children, shutter speed. Children have a talent for moving quickly at the worst moment. So to guard against this, I went for the fastest shutter speed I could shoot with my camera's sync speed. This is the fastest shutter speed that you can shoot with a flash, excluding high-speed sync, which is something completely different. For my Canon 7D, this is 1/250th of a second. Next, I wanted to narrow the angle of view to see less background. I was shooting in an empty gym, which was nice, but I didn't want to see more of it than was necessary. I chose to use a 50mm lens and back way up. This option of a 50mm lens and backing way up won't work for group shots all the time, but it worked really well for this situation. Then I needed an aperture that gave me a large enough depth of field to cover the group, and I wanted this to be as sharp as possible, so I chose f8. Now, some simple checking with our calculator shows me that at f8 and 50mm, at a distance of 22 feet, I will get a depth of field of about 22 feet. Strange that it works out this way, but it does. 4 rows of people is far less than 22 feet. It's more like 6 or 8 feet deep. But remember when we talked about how folks with 20/20 vision can see details 1/3 the size of the maximum circle of confusion standard? This means that if we take the 0.02 max circle of confusion size from my camera and divide by 3, we get 0.006 millimeters. And that gives us about 5.7 feet to work with for our depth of field. So f8 doesn't really seem too crazy, now does it? The final battle here is light and ISO. Want to see what a photo in the gym location looks like with f8 and 1/250th of a shutter speed at ISO 100? Check it out. Black, dark, no information. In order to even get a basic exposure, I'd have to jack the ISO all the way up to 12,800, which is way too noisy. The answer is more light. And in this case, a lot more. I knew that these settings were going to result in the complete elimination of ambient light, but that was okay. I didn't really want the nasty mercury vapor orange gym lights to do a lot of the illumination because it's kind of gross looking. This called for some flash power. In order to cover the group evenly, I went with 2 strobes. Doing it with one would have required to get it in the center and above the group to get the coverage, and I didn't have access to a boom that reached out 12 feet. Plus, with just one strobe, there would have been some fall-off issues near the edges of the group. It wouldn't have been terrible, but I had access to 2 strobes, so it was just easier. I wanted to have the strobes be as close to the axis of the lens as possible. With 2 lights coming from opposite sides, you will get 2 shadows. pulling them in close to the axis of the lens will shorten up the shadows and be less distracting. I did a few test shots with my wife, and it looked like 1/2 power on my Alienbees B800 strobes with the stock reflector would be just enough to expose the group. I also added 2 speed lights on booms behind the group as a bit of a hair light. At full pop, the Canon 580 EX2 and the Yongnuo EX586 did not have nearly the same punch as the B800s, but this was fine and added a really nice sparkle to the hair. Now, if I had less time for setup or I was traveling light, I could have used the same aperture and shutter speed and only 2 speed lights as my main frontal lights. I would have needed to bump up the ISO to 400 or 800, but this would have worked just fine. Because I did have a little bit of time to set up, I chose to use 4 lights, and I think the results were really, really nice. The lights allowed me to isolate the group against the backdrop and give everyone a really nice punchy look. The main thing was making sure I had enough depth of field and that I had a shutter speed that was fast enough to reduce any kid fidgeting. Let's check out the final images. I'm really pleased with the way that these group photos came out. The speed lights in the strobes really helped to give some nice separation and give some really good looking punchy light to these group photos. I was especially happy with the way that the hair light turned out. You can see that there's definitely a really nice sparkle to the hair, especially the guys on the back edges, and a little bit of shoulder kind of edge light there. It's not something that's completely 100% necessary, but if you have the time and the resources, it can really go to make the shot look really nice. And you can see here, this is a 1:1 full zoom look at this photo, and the sharpness is very, very good. If we use 0.02 millimeters for my camera as the circle of confusion, the depth of field calculator would tell us that the bleachers behind the group is in the depth of field. But if you look at the photo, it's just barely outside of it, and that's okay, and that's what I was going for. I wanted maximum sharpness in the group. I didn't want to start losing sharpness because I'm really critical when it comes to sharpness, and I think that this shot worked really, really well, and I was super happy with the way that it came out. Using strobes and speed lights are not always necessary when you're shooting indoor group shots, but they can turn something that's going to be really noisy and probably not so great looking into something that's really, really nice. Now that you have an understanding of how to approach indoor group shots, check out the next lesson where we'll be looking at shooting some portraits in brightly lit conditions.